Morning, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for turning up. If you're sober, conscious, awake, or all three, thank you very much for coming to see our talk. So you want to Red Team. My name's Lorentzen Munro. I'm the worldwide VP for Spider Labs, so I oversee the pen testing and red teaming within the company. I'm also a postgrad at Oxford at the moment. I look at things like red team tactics and all kinds of silly things like that. I used to be a pen tester and a blue teamer. A bit of blue teaming. I really like the strategy elements of those types of things. I'm also speaking quite a lot at the moment, so I spoke at Black Hat US this year, which was really cool. I also used to direct B-Sides London, which used to be here, so it's really nice to speak in the same building. And I'm also on the Crest executive, but don't hold that against me. You can tweet me if you want a message about the talk or anything else on the address above. I'll just hand over to Matt, who's going to be doing the talk with me.
Good morning, everyone. So my name's Matt Lorentzen. I'm a principal security consultant at Spider Labs. So I'm SAS, CC, CCT. I've got some Quest badges. I've sat on a few data center floors in my time, so I'm a jobbing pen tester. My focus in the last couple of years has been around red teaming and purple teaming in particular. Before I sort of came into the industry, I used to work for HP before Spider Labs, and before that I ran my own consultancy company for 7 years. So I've got a bit of an interest in business as well, and that's my Twitter handle at the bottom.
Cool. So today we're going to be talking about the differences between red teaming and pen testing that do exist, thoughts on how to get ahead. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can break into doing red teaming from being a pen tester, or how you can get better and improve and enhance your skills if you're an existing red teamer. We're going to talk a bit about closing skills gaps, and also Matt's going to present a new framework that he's got called Project Lab Seed, which helps people get labs built quicker and adds lots of new functionality to building labs and running labs that helps you get better at things like red teaming. And then we're just going to summarize the whole thing, and hopefully it'll be interesting. So from my perspective, the difference between a red teamer and a pen tester, if I'm taking the business perspective, is about 50K, in honesty. But in terms of the way that people operate, there's definitely a maturity and an understanding of organizations and enterprise security that kind of underpins this. So it's really important to bear that in mind, that before you approach doing red teaming, these types of things, and delivering these types of services for organizations like pen testing firms, that kind of stuff, you need to think about how well-rounded you are, how consultative you are, and sharing that kind of knowledge, and your understanding of things like blue team. So that's really where I'm coming from a lot of the points that I'm making in terms of the differences between red team and pen testing. There's also technical differences in how they're delivered and the concepts behind them, but essentially that's kind of where I'm coming from my perspective.
And I'm very much coming from the eyes on the screen, hands on the keyboard perspective, trying to keep up with this raft of new information that's constantly changing, trying to stay relevant, looking at what was working yesterday and is no longer working today, and trying to just sort of stay on that edge, really.
Sorry about all the swapping. So really, when you look at the different kind of mindsets that you have when you start out doing pen testing, there's really a kind of continuum of your understanding of how things go. And when you start out, you look at tools like Nessus. So Nessus will work for you. You'll get the win. You'll get a shell. You'll maybe use a bit of Metasploit, something like that. And then you'll start automating things to get quicker. It's not necessarily the most eloquent solution, but you're getting things done quickly. You're sticking it all the loot in a database and moving forwards. And as you progress along the continuum of woke, you become more aware of the different things it requires to simulate attackers, and get better at what you're doing and your tradecraft, essentially. This is a very kind of Windows-focused one, kind of perspective, because Windows, if you look in an enterprise environment, is pretty much what you see and what you want to be proficient at. Not that the other world doesn't exist, but it is very important. So looking at technologies like PowerShell and using PowerShell then comes on your radar, and you get more, you realize that there's tools like Powersploit and Empire PowerShell that are going to help you get the things that you want in order to get domain admin in pen testing, those types of things, and moving forwards. And then a bit on the kind of inclusive battlefront, where you have the kind of red versus blue and the continuation of that, things like PowerShell, obfuscate, invoke, obfuscate, that Daniel Bohannon created in order to look at the different ways that you can log PowerShell and how blue teams are actually logging that and how defensive arts are progressing. So obviously you have a kind of back and forth between offensive and defensive as people learn. And then moving forwards, things like Lolbin and Lolbas, a guy called Odvar Mo has done a lot of really good work. You can find it on his GitHub around Lolbin. So it stands for Living Off the Land Binaries. So these are looking at all the different mini applications that you have in Sys32 and in Windows operating systems in order to move forwards and kind of use native applications to get where you want. And there's less likely to get caught by AV and other technologies, EDR, stuff like that, to stop you. And then as you get towards things like RATs and implant frameworks as well, as you become more proficient, you'll start looking at things like GhostPack by Harmjoy, which was released recently as a C# framework for exploiting hosts and doing post-exploitation tasks on Windows hosts, and also things like interacting with Windows APIs such as WMI, DCOM objects, all that kind of good stuff, and the kind of concept, moving towards the concept of living off the land. Arguably, living off the land's kind of been around a long time, and people have been using small things like doing breakouts on hosts and things like that, even going back to things like Wicked Clowns, little talks that you used to do, really cool talks on popping up calculator and running VB scripts off desktops and things like that. So it harks back quite a bit, and it's not new. So how do you know where to go? One of the problems with working as a pen tester in an organization is that the red team can often be siloed off, and there'll be people that you won't necessarily interact with and speak to. So how do you get the skill sets to improve and to actually get better? It can often be very hard. So just thinking about how you actually progress can be quite difficult. There's often a glass ceiling. You don't know where to learn, and there's all these kinds of challenges that you need to overcome. So hopefully today we'll answer some of those questions and give you some hints. So on this slide, I've basically compiled a lot of the people that myself and Matt and find really interesting on Twitter. They provide lots of information. The way that I've split it is red and blue. So down the center, you've got a few folks that kind of span these two worlds and do really well at doing that. Guys like Matt Graeber. Matt Graeber's really well known. He kind of tweets a lot about philosophies, but also really deep technical stuff. He's one of the first guys who disclosed an AMSI bypass as well. So really good stuff comes out of his mouth and his Twitter. OJ Reeves, someone who runs a really good Twitch channel, TV channel as well, as the Colonial. So a lot of his stuff is really interesting. He talks a lot about reverse engineering, does really great walkthroughs. He's based in Australia, so you sometimes have to be up a bit late to catch them, but his videos are really great. Also Casey Smith, and we'll talk a bit about Casey and his contributions to MITRE attack matrix and those types of things. MITRE's also up there. I'll talk a bit about that in a while as well. But Casey makes great contributions to that, and also the atomic red team framework as well. So hopefully that's useful. We'll be sharing the slides at the end if you want any references. Obviously this is an exhaustive list, and we're not endorsing these people, but they are really great and they put out tons of content. So thanks and props to these guys. So thinking about something I mentioned earlier with tool sets is the tool sets that you use for red teaming are different, or you use the same tools in a different way. So we're not in this talk just going to list off lots and lots of different tools, but we will reference some and talk a little bit about the differences in using them. For example, you use mmap in a very different way, using proxy chaining and things like that on a red team, whereas you might just spray everything in a pen test. Tools like Bloodhound, for example, very noisy. You'd use it on a pen test, but not necessarily on a red team. So actually understanding your tools to the depth that you'll understand the different detections that will be available for those tools, and all those different things in terms of stealth goals and goal objectives, high-level goal objectives as well. Also, this introduces a concept of RATs and implant frameworks as well. So if you're not familiar with RATs and implant frameworks, they're essentially tools that replicate more advanced malware behaviors. So things like, you've probably heard of Cobalt Strike and things like that. There's also lots of open source ones available, things like POSH-C2 that was developed by Dave Hardy and Ben Turner, Merlin and Tums that seem to be popping up in Golang. Golang or Go Home seems to be the theme of the moment.
That's a t-shirt, isn't it? It's going to be a t-shirt.
We'll do t-shirts later. And then also thinking about the red team in terms of the strategy. So it's often very goal orientated. So you'll think very high level about the goals and the objectives that you want to achieve, and then contextualize that around the different types of skill sets that you have and the way that you're going to approach it. Very different to a pen test, which is obviously a subset of scope and a subset of activities that you'll do. There's also things like stealth and data exfiltration that you probably won't have considered before if you're moving across from one discipline to another. So stealth's very important, all the way from having things like AWS redirectors in front of your attack infrastructure based on the web to different types of things that you're going to do when you're scanning networks or reconning hosts. You need to be much more pinpoint, and the whole kind of concept with when you're red teaming is you can't start noisy. If you start noisy, you're going to get detected and it's kind of game over to some extent. But what will happen is you need to start very quiet and kind of ramp it up as you need to get a bit more automated in what you're doing. But typically, you'll be very pinpoint in what you do. So something that I started about a year ago that was very useful for me, and I talk a lot about internally with the red teams, is what I call Blue Mondays. So every Monday, I spend about an hour looking at blue team stuff, because historically for myself, I've always been on the offensive side of things, personally and in my career. And the blue team elements are something that I think is very important. So a lot of the time people get, lazy is probably not the right word, but they feel that this world is separate and it doesn't really matter and it doesn't inform what they do as red teamers. But I think it's very much on the contrary, and being purple is something that everyone should do and think about. If you take it from a perspective that someone maybe, you reverse the roles and say, okay, well, a blue team is going to come in and observe my testing, and then from their perspective, with no knowledge of what I'm doing, tell me where I'm going wrong. When you flip that on its head, it's quite an odd situation that you would have. So not understanding things like IRPs, incident response playbooks, all that kind of stuff is really important to understand how enterprises defend from a tactical perspective and getting your TTPs in order, but also from the perspective of you've got to give these guys advice afterwards. And if you don't understand what it is and how they operate, then that's really going to be a struggle. Also, the goals of a red team are different. A lot of people think, oh, red teaming is about getting in, it's about penetration, it's about exploiting and pwning. I don't think it is. It's about detection, it's about response, and it's about recovery and testing those mechanisms to make sure that they're effective. A lot of people, I think, don't get into security or do get into security for the right reasons. They want to improve the state of security, but I think that sometimes gets a bit lost. They get stuck in a routine of wanting to win all the time, and winning is less important than improving the state of security. So being consultative and knowing these types of things and helping out is a very kind of strong belief of mine of what people should do. Also learning things like MITRE ATT&CK matrix. So MITRE ATT&CK matrix has been a very useful thing that's kind of appeared over the last couple of years. So MITRE ATT&CK matrix is essentially a grid with lots of different techniques that you can do. So exploit routes, not exploit routes, but attack chains that you can perform against an organization. And it's almost like an audit function. So for organizations who do these types of things, there's also Atomic Red Team that sits alongside that was developed by Red Canary and Casey Smith in particular. How this is really useful for you guys or people looking to do red teaming is where you audit an organization and you look at the the different paths and attack chains that you can actually get and your defenses against them, you can also do that with your skill sets. So if you're looking at MITRE ATT&CK matrix and you're saying, I don't know what that is, I don't know what that is, that's probably alarm bells to some extent. Not everyone's going to know everything, but if you're very proactive in developing your skills and what you want to do, looking at this gives you a good reference as to the types of things that you want to be doing on engagements and how you can upskill to get there. So I think that's a very important message. So one of the things is that I found, especially with technical people and especially with red teamers, is there's a kind of disregard for threat intelligence. And the Venn of snake oil kind of illustrates that a little bit, or some of the things that you can do to actually get value from it. Because I think if you're using threat intelligence in a certain way to inform scenarios of how you're going to actually do the attacks, I think that there can sometimes be a very limited value in that. But if you're taking it from the perspective of being an attacker and someone who wants to replicate these types of things, I think it informs different techniques, different mindsets, and different ways to do it. Some of them will be relevant, some of them won't be so relevant, where you have insider threats and things like that you can't leverage in your own everyday lives. But a lot of it, looking at malware and all those kinds of intelligence elements that you can bring into it, are really important. So on the Venn diagram that I put up on the board, I think it's important to think about disregard. So if you take threat intelligence as a concept and say, these are all the things that have happened, and they might happen to my organization, so I need to be ready for these types of things. It really boils down to there only being what's technically possible, what you can do, and how long you've got. So a lot of the time, the TI doesn't even matter. But from a personal perspective and a kind of more broad perspective, you can contextualize that and use it in a different way than perhaps is intended, or it's being used by things like frameworks like CBEST, TIBA, STAR, all those kinds of things. So there are limitations, but I think there are also benefits as well. So I think getting into a team as well, it shouldn't be magic. I always laugh at this one. It shouldn't be magic getting into a red team. You know, it should be more easy, and it should be easier to develop your skills. So I think the thing I always tell people who are kind of coming up through the ranks is be a jack of all trades and a master of some. So have a broad background, but then get really technical at certain areas and have certain strengths. Also, don't neglect your apt game. So if you look at all the attacks that happen, you can see that quite often it's through application vectors that people get owned or lose their data. And I think quite a lot of the time, red teamers kind of get obsessed to some extent with executing the kill chain. So gaining persistence on hosts, pivoting, you know, moving through networks, all that stuff is noisy. If you're just looking at a database that's on the back end of an app, just look for SQL injection, look for XXC and remote code execution on the boxes. So definitely app is kind of sexy again, and don't neglect your app game. Also look at creating niches. So where you're trying to get into a team within an organization, sometimes you'll feel that you don't maybe have the profile, or the people in the team don't think you're good enough to do these kinds of things. So look at the different ways that you can get in tactically. So look at the niches. So something I tell to junior people who kind of come to me and say, oh, I want to do red teaming. Say, well, look at the team. What's the structure? Are there people who do TI? For example, in the UK, there's a lot of frameworks that require TI in order to build things to simulate attacks. Who's doing the TI? Could you be that guy? Is that your way in? What about social engineering as vectors? Are there other things that you can contribute that other people can't that are going to be really helpful? Also, read lots. So reading is really important. I'm quite surprised often that I mention things as someone who hasn't been on the command line for about 6 years, when I tell people about new techniques or new tools and things, and it's kind of news to them. So coming from me, it's sometimes kind of sad that they're not reading and staying up to date. I mean, there's a lot of things to process, but when you kind of filter it and get really directed in what you want to do, reading and building labs and doing these kinds of things are really the ways that you're going to progress. And if you're not progressing, it's going to be apparent to everyone else that you're kind of stagnating in what you know and what you do. And that's not what you're looking for. That's not what I'm looking for as someone who builds these teams and makes effective teams to do these types of tasks. Also, make your goals really clear. So another kind of pet peeve of mine is a lot of people say, oh, well, I want to do red teaming, but you haven't helped me. It's like, well, I didn't know. Why didn't you tell me? You know, make it apparent. You should always talk to your colleagues who do these kinds of things. Talk to your bosses, talk to your managers, and make it apparent, because it's not always clear. I think at the moment everyone either is or wants to be a red teamer in the pen testing world, but so few are. So just make your goals clear and try and look for mentors within the group who will help and support that kind of approach that you want to take. Also network externally as well. I find so many people who start developing a tool or a concept that they think is really cool, only to find that someone else has already done it, or something along those lines, but they don't do their research, they don't reach out. People are really, really friendly. The guys at Spectrops, for example, they help so many people with all these different projects. It's really important to network, because when you move into your next job, people use recommendations a lot in our industry. It is still quite small and in its genesis in a way. So what will happen is you'll get recommendations. If you interact with people and they understand your skills and they can see you've got skills, then it can facilitate in developing your career as well. So talk to people, don't be scared. Just walk up, say hi, and talk to people who've got similar interests to you. Look on GitHub, all those kinds of good things. Also take the opportunity to look at niche technologies. So if you're looking at things like red teaming, where do we sell lots of red teaming? Where does that always exist? Financial services. If you can get application experience doing Swift or things like that, that's going to be really useful for you. So in terms of filling your gaps and kind of filling that knowledge, something that Matt's going to be presenting about and showing you a lot of is different labs and different ways to make them realistic in order to develop your skills and test yourself. And generate random environments that you can do this in. So you can also fill your gaps with instructor-led training, conferences like 44Con, James Forshaw's workshop this week. All these kinds of things appear at all these different conferences, sometimes for free, sometimes for a small cost. Think about yourself constructively and build yourself into the kind of tester person that you want to be. And look for mentors. You might find them in your organization, you might find them externally. But it's always worth networking and speaking to people about these things. You'll find that other people have the same aspirations and goals and maybe more experience. And finally, before I hand over to Matt, don't be a dick. Like, there's lots of dicks about, but maybe you've got one, maybe you are one. It's the... A lot of people behave in such a way. It's just, you need to play nice with people. You need to be approachable. You need to think about what you're doing and behave in a professional manner. We do have a subculture within pen testing communities that tends to be anti-authoritarian and, occasionally trolling and stuff like that. Maybe you fire up some sort of troll account for a large pen testing company or whatever. All these things are not the right way to behave, and we should think about, being nice to each other, building people up rather than tearing them down, and how we can do that. So I'll hand over to Matt.
So practice makes perfect. That's kind of where we are. A lot of my initial journey into this was sort of self-directed learning, and I think you need that. You need the tenacity to smash into these brick walls and push through, and things like OSCP are really good for that. But the problem with that approach is, how do you know whether you're smashing into the right brick wall? You could be, completely in the wrong way. So I think a better mantra for this is perfect practice makes perfect. And not many people look at I haven't met many people that actually really look at their processes and see where they can gain efficiencies. I would say it's a strength of mine that I can look at my processes and see where I can gain efficiencies. It's always a curse, because I'm probably my own harshest critic. So I'm really good at finding out what I'm not very good at and trying to fill those holes, but I'm not actually that good at acknowledging the things that I am more successful in. But I follow this through, and there's a great quote from Michael Jordan, the American basketball star, and he's like, you can shoot 8 hours a day, essentially, but if your technique is wrong, all you end up at is shooting really badly. It's all about the basics, getting that foundation right. I'm a sysadmin, so, former Microsoft sysadmin, and I think that helps me a lot in understanding networks and structures. And if you ever see any pictures of Michael Jordan, he's always smiling, and it's because he's worth $1.7 billion, because he's spent a lot of time realizing that it's all in his basics, and that's how he essentially built his career. So I kind of look at this from, I know how to build networks as a sysadmin. What are the components that I need to create a representative company so that I can try some of these techniques out? And they basically boil down to these 3 sections. We've got machines that we need to run. We need a domain structure. Active Directory is ubiquitous. Love it or hate it. That's just the way of the world. And then user emulation, and actually how do I replicate proper network traffic? Because very rarely are they just a collection of static machines that don't have any relationship. That's obviously the people communicating within them that are it's alive, it's a breathing thing. And certainly in red teaming, we focus more on attacking those user configurations and how we can move through a network in the users rather than sort of SMB exploits, etc. So I started building demo labs. I've been building them for a couple of years now, but if you take this as an example of a demo lab, it's got multiple sections to it. It's representative of a company environment in the sense that it can have nested Active Directory domains, so parent-child relationships. It has a customer network, so there's a forest trust in place there, and we can sort of emulate these fairly large organizations. And I want to build big networks. I mean, I have a little network that I carry around on my laptop, but the environments that I really want to build internally, I want them to be 40, 50, 100 machines. I basically want to get abusive emails saying that we're going to have to reinvest in SANs to cover the cost of disk space. I want them to be big, big things, right? And Lawrence screaming at me about the bills. So thinking about building stuff, you can always cheat. That would be a good start. If you just want to get going, there's some great repos here, Microsoft being the first. So if you go to the Microsoft GitHub, there's a PowerShell script that will allow you to just stand up an Active Directory infrastructure. It uses Hyper-V, which is great because it's their tool. Not so great if you want to introduce other weirder machines. And also Hyper-V has a restriction in the version of Windows Server that you can run on it. So you're kind of restricted to anything to 2008 R2 and above. So, maybe if you don't want if you want to replicate older networking, that's not such a great solution. An automated lab is the same type of thing. One that I really like that I've been looking at for a while now is the detection lab project, and that kind of leans to my approach. They use Packer and they look at it's quite intensive in how you build these machines, so how can we make efficiencies with that? And a lot of the seeds of these projects for me, I read a paper from the University of Amsterdam published last year, and Mark Smeets was one of the mentors on that. So if you follow the sphere, he's always got some interesting things to say. And they were basically looking at all of the available solutions against their own approach, and they did a sort of a cost comparison, essentially, as to where it was. So if you look at hypervisors, I'm a really big fan of Proxmox. If you've never heard of it before, you should check it out. VMware is paid for when you start getting into the features that you want. Obviously, Hyper-V is a solution, and you can run things on VirtualBox. But when you're talking about big labs, you basically need somewhere to run this. And it's as I said, it's a known problem. Carlos Perez was just tweeting the other day about it's taken him far too much time to build his home lab, and now he's got to start configuring all of the components. So I really started to focus on this as a way that I could think about improving things. So essentially, Project Labs is the wrapper for some of this sort of stuff, and how can I build these places where I can test these things out? What does my traffic look like on the wire? How can I detect it? How can I look at token manipulation and running DC sync and all this sort of stuff? How can I sort of level up? And I want it to be focused on building these labs without manual control. We've all got better things to do than sit there clicking next, and worrying about Microsoft activation keys. And I want to build large Active Directory infrastructures, rich Active Directory infrastructures with lots of users and lots of information inside these Active Directory structures that I have to pull out. And then the final challenge is emulating user behaviors. How do you actually make it look like they're real users and not necessarily collections of scripts? So I'll introduce some tools for that. And then I want it to be introduce entropy and make it random, so that even though I've built it, I don't necessarily want to know all the components of this lab. The whole purpose of this is to facilitate my learning. So if I've built it, it's like I'm taking my own exam. So I want to build in that randomness so that I can focus on the principles of what I'm trying to achieve, enumeration, etc., without necessarily knowing the answers for that. And it's a good place to practice DDDIO, which is a term coined by Lawrence, which is dangerous, destructive, disruptive, illegal, or out-of-scope activities. So let's say you actually want to backdoor Active Directory. It's probably not a good idea if you do that on a customer network. It would be a challenge to explain the outcome of that. But still, we should be exploring the ramifications of these things, because as soon as it gets put into a framework, like a golden ticket, somebody's going to click the big red button. So it would be interesting to explore these. So in terms of building machines, my focus is Packer. And if you haven't heard about Packer, it's basically a mechanism for creating a machine image, automating the processes in and out of that, and then deploying it to a lot of places, because one person might want to use Hyper-V, another person might want to push it to AWS. My approach to this is Packer basically has JSON files, so it describes what the machine's going to be like, what happens when it boots up, what happens in the middle, and what happens when it's finished and where it pushes it to. So you would make a base Windows image, and then you would see the rest of the lab from that. You can use the Microsoft 180-day evaluation solution, so that's 6 months for free. You don't care about the nag screens, and this is the point. We want to build that randomness, so we should have a process where we can just squash this lab and stand the whole thing up again and have another free 6 months to do all this sort of stuff. You can see on the slide that here's all the builders that it supports. So basically it can create images for all of those places, which pretty much covers, I would say, 90% of the market. And if it doesn't have a builder that's supported for you, you can write your own. So this is a solved problem in the DevOps community, in that they do these sorts of things for testing. And I'm certainly borrowing a lot of inspiration from their processes for that. So that's an example of the JSON file. You just define what the VM is going to be called, where the ISO URL is. You can't see that further down, but I've got a video in a second. It's quite human readable. And then the floppy files, you're basically adding in processes that the machine starts up. So it's going to automate sysprep and all those sorts of things so that you have a unique image. And this is extended from the detection lab. So as a video of that process, basically you can validate that the template is working, and once it validates, you can basically say build. And what it will do is it will go away to the evaluation solution, it will download the ISO for you, and it will use that as a seed. I've already downloaded that solution, so it's going to go away, and then it will start going through the build process. As you can see, it's pulling it down, and it's starting the machine through. Lots of manual stuff. So you can choose to install updates or not install updates, depending on what you want. This isn't a 5-minute solution. You can build these sorts of labs in a couple of hours, but the whole point about this is that you're not standing there having to touch this sort of stuff. Installing updates is an interesting one, because it may be that you want out-of-date patched machines, missing patches, and look at that sort of stuff. I'm going to release some scripts looking at how we can automate some of this solution. And the goal is make whatever your own lab is with different network segments. But if you look at this, that's only one piece of the puzzle. The lab is just machines at this point in time, and we need these edge controls in place. So in this example, there's actually 3 firewalls. One which is handling the connections between the corporate and the IT environments, and development, which is a proxy server, and then there's a secondary. Just as in a corporate environment, you have multiple layers of control, and I want that in a lab so that I can look at putting challenges in place and thinking about what my traffic is and what are the controls between the two. So if anybody's heard of it before, I'm a huge fan of Vios, which is like a hardware emulation router. It used to be called Viata. Brocade bought it, subsequently quickly killed off the community edition, but thankfully the superheroes at Vios forked it before it was buried, and it does everything. It's really powerful, and if you've done any Cisco configuration or Juniper work, it will feel very familiar to you. It's actually based on the Juniper standard. And this, just on the right-hand side, there's just some examples of all the things that you can do out of the box. I generally tend to use the firewall, proxy, and the DHCP capabilities of it, but it's very, very powerful. You can emulate site-to-site VPNs with it and all that sort of stuff. And how I use it in the context of the lab is basically I have a master Vios, and that has an interface in each of these network segments that are created, and then I can control the traffic between them. We can specify that 1111 can only talk on certain ports to anything in the adjacent subnets, and we can build more realistic network examples. We would like to say that we don't see flat networks on a daily basis, and we would recommend that they are segmented, but even so, it's still a common thing. So the next thing is, once you've got your environment in place, you need to start thinking about Active Directory and domain accounts. Like, how can we do that? Because as I said before, I want to be able to go through the process of enumerating Active Directory and searching for things rather than necessarily knowing what's out there. That's the whole point of the learning for me, is in getting better at those skill sets and improving my tradecraft. So when I'm creating these, I thought, well, what do I actually need to introduce into this seeding approach? I need them to be unique accounts. I want them to be random, so I don't actually want to know what the usernames and think information about that person is. I want them to be able to generate random passwords, because that's really good for things like testing out hashcat masking. And maybe you want to do some cracking, drop ntds.dit and test out some strategies about how you can improve your cracking. I want them to be able to choose source lists. Things like the Common Speak 2 source list, word lists are really good. They're action from true real-world GitHub repositories. I like the real password lists as well. They're from passwords that people choose. And also choosing your own source list. I've been on jobs where we've scraped the company website beforehand, and they've been things like beer brands, German beer brands that aren't in common. You have to find them out. So they're very unique to that company, and obviously people that are part of the company tend to affiliate to that. So some of the passwords are choices that are relevant. So we managed to recover a lot of passwords that way, and it kind of made me think, well, I want that ability to be able to provide randomness there, and I want to make it at volume. I want lots and lots of users in lots and lots of places, so that I really have to wade through those details to get to the end. So I'm going to be pushing a tool called User over the weekend to the Spider Labs GitHub repo. It's a tool that uses Faker. If you've ever done any use, it's in Ruby. There's some options there. And it generates a large number of users at random. So I can create 100,000 users in about 30 seconds. I got to 1 million users the other day, and it was under 3 minutes. I mean, that's a big Active Directory to have that number of users. And it basically chooses password lists or the word list that you've specified, and it picks them at random. And it spits out a CSV file with those credentials and a PowerShell file that you can run on the DC. So if you think back to how you could automate this with Packer, that would be part of a post-process procedure to import all of these users in. And there's an example of this at the top. So it's a command line scenario. So you pass in the solutions, and it spits out these files for you. And in the first example, I've got a CSV file, and it's generated 20-character random passwords for all of those users. So that's really good. I can import that into Active Directory. And there's a PowerShell file that it writes for you, which is relevant to that CSV file it's just created. I do direct LDAP connections using Active PowerShell accelerators rather than using the Active Directory commandlets, because it means that it runs on things like 2008 DCs, which don't have some of those controls. And then the second example is that I've just created it with a word list to do the same thing, basically. So you take the CSV file and take it to a DC, and then you can basically run the tool, and it will import it. It will create an object for each user. It will push them in, and you can really get rich with the types of LDAP properties that you can attach to these users. So it supports names and addresses and locales, so you can create German addresses, Asian addresses, English addresses. And the whole point about this is to bury stuff into the directory that you have to say to people, hey, can you go and find me all of the people that live in this county whose name begins with B? These are all good strategies to build up our tradecraft to try and find where these users are and how they're relevant. I'll fast forward. This was a 10,000 list file that I created, so I'll just skip through to showing you the end. So down the bottom, it's imported 1,000 users, and then when you refresh, all of those users are in there. Now, I don't know any of these people's names. They're all active accounts now that I can now go and start exploring. So there's still a missing piece. So we have a structure to build domains, and we have an approach to seeding Active Directory with random information that we don't know about. But the point, as I said before, is it's about how do we emulate user actions. That is part of the network. We're attacking the users. How do we do that? So I'm introducing a tool called Sheeple. Essentially, it's designed to emulate all of the things that can be represented by a user. If you think about what a user does and how they interact with the system, my goal is really to try and emulate all of that activity and have benign actions as well as malicious actions so that it's useful for both sides of that equation. Blue teamers can use it for detection capabilities to see whether they can find that specific PowerShell download cradle in a massive network noise, rather than being everybody got their sensors ready, right, click, we can see that event. Try and blend things into the noise. And it really came about from reading the paper that I said before, and that they did a large study. And then they found that there wasn't really anything there for users to generate files. The sorts of common things that users do within a network, generating artifacts, content, interacting with each other, all of those sorts of things. So this stayed with me, and I kind of researched and thought about ways that I could do this. And I realized that I've kind of been here before because I'm a sysadmin. And when I ran my own company, I had to do a lot of deployment software. So I wanted to look at ways of automating it, and when I'd get pieces of software that couldn't be deployed or MSI wrapped because they were written in 1995 for Windows 95 and they would just break, I needed a better solution rather than the concept of sitting at 1,000 machines clicking next, 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 next. So I used a tool called Auto-It for that solution. And if you don't know what Auto-It is, it's a basic-like language. It's freeware. It fully integrates and controls Windows. So it's very powerful. You can hook it in at the kernel level. You can interface with COM objects, but you can automate any part of the graphical interface. So you can move mice, you can send keys. And I really started to realize, well, how far can I push this technology to try and replicate the type of user activities that I want? So if you think about what a user does, they create tasks, they have things that they do within a day. So I wanted them to be able to create Word documents and interact with command shells and load up PowerShell and create remote desktop connections. And all of that needed to be in a random time because I didn't want to necessarily know when that would happen. A problem with sort of traditional script-based approaches is they're generally on a scheduled loop and they'll run every 10 minutes, so they're predictable. So that's good initially, but then immediately the return of investment diminishes because now you already know what the answer is going to be. You know when things are going to happen. So it removes those moments of opportunity and ways to sort of see if you can catch that. So in this example, I'm just using the command line version to mass create sheeple. I will say we still haven't properly agreed on whether it's a sheeple, a sheps, a scherson, what's the plural of sheeple. It's all been quite interesting over beers as to what actually this thing is, but that's part of the fun. It has two modes. It has this mode so that you can put it into a wider scripting solution, or I've written an interactive solution as well. So it basically uses Python to spit out these valid Auto-It files that control the functions, and you'll see some of the benefits of Auto-It in a minute. This is an example of running the CMD interaction and all the things that get pushed out. And I've written all of the actions as Python 3 classes. So, adding new behaviors into this, you should be able to extend it. And with some little tweaks to where these things get pulled in as arguments, you should be able to add those in. So this is an example of running it interactive mode. So you get this lab, and you can list the types of current functionalities that they can do. As you can see, they can create Word files and CMD and PowerShell, etc. You create a thing, a scherson, sheeple, whatever. In this case, I'm creating one called 44con. And you specify how long that wants to be. So I want to be able to say things like they can do tasks over 8 hours and maybe give them 3 things to do in those 8 hours, and you're not entirely sure when they're going to happen. So I've specified going to the CMD prompt here, and these are the commands that I want you to execute when you get to the CMD window. All the common things, if you start thinking about anything that you can type on a keyboard can be emulated. So I keep on coming back to that. You can make good sheeple or bad sheeple. It's entirely up to you. But I've actually started using this to sort of emulate malware and maybe some of the other things that I kind of look at to do diversionary tactics and things. Anything that you can type on a keyboard can be emulated with this process. Also, it supports all of the Windows hotkeys, so you can get very creative and complex with these tasks. So in the second one, I'm just now giving it a second task, which is PowerShell. I've truncated the times here. Any of my demos are over sort of 1 minute. They perform all of these tasks over 1 minute. It's got some logic for things like if you pass in the wrong commands, it will say, hey, no, this is actually what you need to do. And there's going to be one more interaction, which is a tea break, which is quite nice because that gives you the option of introducing even more sort of randomness into it. There's a period of time as a task where they just don't do anything. They sit dormant, sleep, and then after they've had their tea break, they're going to come back and they're going to go to open up IE on Google. And it spits out this Auto-It file that you end up with, and then you compile that using the A2E XE version. So this can work It's good to work on Windows. I've deliberately written the tool in Python 3 so that it doesn't have any external dependencies so that you can run it on Windows without too much of a headache. But you can also run this on Wine and compile it that way. And when you look at the output here, when I run as a process list, I run 44con.exe, which was what I showed you before. And if you look at the process tree, 44con.exe spawns as a child process of Explorer. So straight away, that's really good. Like EDR solutions commonly look at how the process tree is and Excel's spawning calc, which is a bit of an anomaly, and that's a strange thing. But because we're sending keystrokes, all of these keystrokes can actually be keyloggable. So, I'll show you some examples later where you can intercept the types of things that they're typing. So, that brings in opportunities of copying the keyboard and monitoring that. And you can see as they're typing these commands in, if it needs to spawn a sub-process under CMD, then it will do that. I've pushed the Process Explorer to the front here because one of the challenges with the scripting is if something steals that focus, all of a sudden all your commands are being pushed into the calc window and really bad things happen. So it has a feature where as soon as it realizes it needs to act with CMD again, it will immediately take the focus back from the GINA and it will bring that window to the forefront. So it's very sticky like that. So it solves those sorts of problems. As you can see, I can minimize it here. Just to try and disrupt the process, but it will quickly open it back up again and it will finish the last command in that task block. So hopefully after a couple of seconds, he's probably potentially on a tea break, but he's going to open up PowerShell and he's going to run all this sort of stuff. So as you can start to think about what you would use PowerShell for, this could be anything. This could be an IEX download cradle to invoke Mimikatz as an example, or whatever you can type on a keyboard, we can emulate. So you just have to think about what your processes are. And a lot of this stuff has been informed by how I actually work anyway, and me looking at my process to think, well, can I actually automate that? Can I make a sheeple do that? And hopefully, when it's finished, I'm mindful of time, he should open IE. I'll skip to the magic. So it all obviously looks like magic. Like Lawrence said, it wasn't magic, but Paul Daniels disagrees. It really is. So if you look at this in a more realistic scenario, so that's the example. It can show you how we can spawn processes, but how can we sort of properly emulate? So my last video is really kind of giving you the full picture of this. So I've got Cobalt Strike running with a beacon active already. I've extended this 44con sheeple that I've created. I don't need to show you how to build that anymore. It's running my sort of go-to IP configs. I'm building in other things, like as you can see, there's a spelling mistake there, so he's quickly back, because if you ever watch me typing, I'm atrocious. So bringing in sort of randomness into how they type and adding in mistakes makes it more difficult for us to try and pass this blob of keylogging that we get back. I think all of these sorts of things are really useful. We don't expect everything to come through. And you can control how fast they type as well. So I like the idea of having chicken peckers that take like three weeks to type 3 commands so that you really have to work with that. And then the next task is going to open up 44con. It's going to open up a Word document. It's going to send the commands to change heading types and all this sort of stuff. So it's pretty fun to think about how you can interact with Word. You can insert pictures and do any of that sort of stuff. Pretty good from that perspective. There's a spelling mistake in there. It has been grepped to be a part of this. I think we all deserve to be grepped frequently. So I hope you can see that the value in this isn't really so gimmicky. It's about how can I create things that I can then work on attacking and really focus on what my attack process is. So after it's finished, it will save that document onto the desktop, 44con thanks. And there's other tasks, some harder than others. So as I said to you before, I wanted to emulate things like RDP so that, or run as tokens, so that these processes that are being spawned by these things are in the context of another user. Or I can screenshot people interacting with things so that I kind of understand if they're using an application, what does that application look like? A really good red teamer friend of mine was saying that sometimes he just watches. So I'm just spawning PowerShell from C&D because the blue was difficult to see, and it's interesting to show. And I'm just doing like a bits transfer, which is one way that I like to download stuff. So it's just basically pulled down a text file, which is from my web server over a bits transfer, and it's got the content. And you can see down the bottom, that's the header for connecting that. And then I start thinking, well, what else can we do? Like Lawrence has mentioned a lot about Red Canary stuff. So this is basically executing the MITRE TI 1063 example for security software discovery. So if you're a blue teamer and you've got PowerShell logging on, you can just chuck this stuff out there and see whether in your logs you can find out the fact that here is a person that's actually enumerating the endpoint. And as you can see, we've got a positive response for the fact that Defender is actually running there. And then more complex tasks when it catches up. So this is quite hard, like RDP, because I kind of fell into a rabbit hole of nested subcommands where I actually wanted them to be able to enter commands into the RDP sessions that they're then creating. And I've changed some of the logic so that a sheeple can do that. It can open up an RDP connection and it can issue commands into that and then mess around with window focus and stuff. I didn't have an internet connection, so that one failed. And then obviously we see people storing creds in Notepad regularly, so we can stick some creds in there, and that's all available to be logged. And if you look from the Cobalt strike, you can see I've received a ton of those keystrokes. This sheeple is a fast typer, so she's probably a PA, I say she, or he. And you can see that these are the keystrokes that I've captured. So you don't get all of it. You can mess around with this. If you ramp up the milliseconds, they type slower and you can get more key logging. And if you don't, then you get fragments of that information that you then have to sort of bolt back together. So in conclusion, I think realistic labs will help you develop your skills. It's certainly been a fun area for me to explore, a place where I can kind of get an interactive relationship going with it, and I can test where I can see what I would expect to work and what not. I want rich Active Directory infrastructures full of information that I don't know, that I then have to go and find. And I think Sheeple is a good solution to sort of emulating user behavior, and I can continue to push the boundaries of that. I've got some ideas for an actual official 1.0 release that introduce the concept of profiles, where you apply a blue team profile and they will actually pass the event logs and maybe respond to actions based on what they see, like resetting all the passwords in Active Directory would be one solution. So I can extend it. Big thanks to Ed for all the chats about this over Slack of ideas and stuff, and obviously Lawrence for everything, pretty much. And thank you to 44Con for letting me speak. It's the first time that I've actually ever been to the conference, so to have the opportunity to speak here has been awesome. So thank you.